All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. We're looking at a massive jurisdictional clash happening right now. It's a deeply complex incident over on Canal Street, where local homicide detectives, federal agencies, and eyewitnesses are all essentially colliding. And it's a scenario that completely upends everything we know about standard police investigations. Let's unpack exactly what went down and why this specific incident has triggered such an intense legal and bureaucratic standoff.
So, picture this. What actually happens when the prime suspect in a homicide is the exact same agency that arrests the witnesses? Think about standard investigative procedure just for a second. When a shooting happens, the absolutely critical first step for local detectives is to isolate and interview the eyewitnesses, right? You have to get a clear picture of what happened. But here, we're looking at a totally inverted reality. I mean, how do local authorities run a by-the-book investigation when the federal agency involved in a fatal shooting is literally the exact same agency detaining the only civilian eyewitnesses to the event?
Well, according to the source text, you get what they call a federal black hole. And honestly, that's a pretty dramatic but incredibly fitting description. They use this term to impartially describe the absolute information vacuum that followed the recent shooting of a man named Lorenzo Salgado Araujo. It's not just a buzzword either. It describes a very literal barrier where information, witnesses, standard operating procedures, they all seem to cross this event horizon and just disappear, totally out of reach for local law enforcement. The timeline here is it's startling. Hour 0, Lorenzo is shot on Canal Street. At the time, there were 3 other men sitting inside his white van, his construction crew. And crucially, this included his own brother, Victor Hugo, and a guy named Daniel Tirado. Just minutes later, instead of being interviewed as witnesses to a fatal use of force, bystander video actually shows them handcuffed on the pavement by federal agents. Then fast forward to Wednesday morning, Daniel manages to make this brief 5-minute phone call, and after that, total silence. Nothing. That 5-minute phone call is really where this gets chilling. Daniel Tirado's family claims he made a frantic call to his wife that Wednesday morning. In that incredibly brief window, he tells her an ICE agent shot Lorenzo and then slammed the van door shut. But since that one isolated call, absolutely nothing. Lorenzo's son, Ronaldo, has publicly confirmed that the family hasn't heard a single word from Victor Hugo, his uncle, or anyone else in the crew since the morning of the murder. That abrupt cutoff really shows you just how tightly controlled the communication has become.
Okay, so you really have to understand the bureaucratic reality making this silence possible. The source points out the sheer operational absurdity of these concurrent federal reviews happening right now. On one side, you have the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General, the internal watchdog, and the FBI allegedly reviewing the shooting. But at the exact same time, ICE, the agency under external investigation for the shooting, has taken the only civilian eyewitnesses and transferred them directly into civil immigration detention.
The source actually uses some incredibly charged language here to describe this dynamic, flatly stating they are holding them hostage. Now, we're just looking at how the source frames this, right? But the claim is that ICE has effectively silenced these men by placing them in an immigration lockup. Inside that facility, they can't hold press conferences, they can't talk to the media, they are completely cut off from the public eye. The argument is that this wasn't just some standard processing move, it was a deliberate mechanism to enforce total silence.
Which brings up a really crucial question. How in the world does a local authority investigate a homicide under conditions like this? I mean, think about how paralyzing this is for local detectives. Their entire job relies on witness testimony. If the federal government has completely locked down the absolute only people who saw what happened, local law enforcement is pretty much hitting a brick wall.
And that brings us to what the source brilliantly calls a jurisdictional fortress. On one side, you've got Harris County District Attorney Sean Tier, who has officially opened a local homicide investigation. But on the other side, an impenetrable fortress. ICE is keeping these undocumented detainees locked in a system that Tier's local detectives just can't breach. They can't just waltz into a federal detention center and pull them out for interviews without explicit federal consent. And according to the source material, ICE is absolutely 100% not consenting to those interviews.
But the roadblocks don't stop at physical detention. There's also this massive hurdle of a 397-day delay. It's alleged that ICE isn't just relying on physical cages, they're also hiding crucial physical evidence, specifically the dashcam footage of the incident. This footage is reportedly stuck behind the standard backlog for OIG investigations, which is a whopping 397-day delay. That effectively buries the video evidence in red tape for over a year. So local authorities are getting boxed out on 2 fronts here. They're denied access to the video evidence, and they're denied access to the actual human beings who witnessed it.
So what's the point of this dual strategy of isolation? Well, the claim is that it serves a very specific, very chilling purpose. The argument is that locking the witnesses away and withholding the footage ensures that, quote, the only narrative that makes it to the paperwork is the one written by the agent who pulled the trigger. The physical reality of detaining those witnesses perfectly matches the bureaucratic reality of the delayed investigation. It creates this vacuum, right? A vacuum where the only official documented version of events comes from the exact agency being investigated.
So how do you break through a wall that thick? The source details this massive, multi-pronged counteroffensive. On the local level, DATRA could use a material witness warrant, basically convening a Harris County grand jury to subpoena the men, effectively accusing the federal government of harboring witnesses to a state murder. And on the legislative front, the Houston Democratic delegation isn't backing down either. They issued a 48-hour ultimatum for ICE to preserve dispatch and detention records, plus Representative Al Green is demanding an oversight hearing, which is the mandatory first step to issuing binding congressional subpoenas to force them to release that withheld dashcam footage.
But the real frontline here? That's happening in federal court, starting with habeas corpus. See, because these witnesses are in civil, not criminal custody, they actually retain their Fifth Amendment due process rights. Civil rights lawyers are preparing writs to force ICE to bring these men before a federal judge and legally justify this incommunicado detention. And they aren't stopping there. Lawyers are also prepping an emergency anti-deportation temporary restraining order. It's essentially a legal pause button, arguing that deporting these men is basically the intentional destruction of evidence in a state homicide case. On top of that, local police can issue a U-Visa shield, which legally designates the men as victims or witnesses of a crime, forcing ICE to completely pause removal proceedings and keep them right here in the U.S.
Which leaves us with this absolutely incredible standoff. In this high-stakes battle, pitting a local homicide investigation and civil rights attorneys against the formidable walls of federal immigration detention. Who actually wins? Will congressional subpoenas, U-Visas, and writs of habeas corpus have enough legal teeth to pierce this federal black hole and finally uncover the truth of what went down on Canal Street? It's a fascinating, entirely unprecedented test of jurisdiction, and you can bet the world is watching closely to see how it all shakes out.